Our group is going to cover chapters 2 and 3 of part 2, so the very end of the book. In chapter 2, John Paul II begins by talking about the language of the body, and he does this in a lot of different ways. He begins with the marital promise. When a man says to a woman and a woman says to a man, "I take you to be my husband," or "I take you to be my wife," that is an efficacious sign. That promise, later realized through the consummation of the conjugal act, initiates that sacrament. They administer that sacrament to each other. This means that they constitute the full and visible sign of that sacrament itself, and in doing so they become reciprocal gift to each other. A proper understanding of the marital vows through the language of the body, so that a man and a woman, in John Paul II's words, form an unrepeatable sign which also has a future-oriented meaning, all the days of my life, that is, until death. This is the visible and efficacious sign of the covenant with God in Christ, that is, of grace, which is to become their portion in this sign as their own gift. John Paul II then moves on to discuss what he calls the prophetism of the body, which he refers much to the Old Testament and the biblical tradition. He begins by drawing two analogies of God in the Old Testament and man. The first is the marriage between God and Israel through the various covenants of a husband and wife relationship, which is a very beautiful distinction between Yahweh's lordship over them and his relationship as husband and wife with Israel, because it's just a very unique distinction in Christianity and Catholicism that Yahweh's absolute lordship also becomes absolute love in that marriage between God and Israel. He also talks about the analogies in the Old Testament of the language of the body in a very subjective sense. They speak a lot about man and woman becoming one flesh, and how the body itself speaks. This is very evident to see in something like Hosea, where idolatry is seen as adultery towards God, because even though it's very physical, and we will see how later this reflects the Sermon on the Mount too, and Jesus' teachings there, this is not a physical adultery, but we've broken a promise towards God and that marriage towards God by when the Israelites worshipped idols, and that breaks that covenant with God. The Old Testament makes it very clear that man cannot fully express himself in words, and the language of the body is very necessary a lot of times. It also makes clear how the body tells the truth through love, and it lies in adultery and falsehood. It tells the truth of its marriage with Jesus by loving and honoring that relationship that it has promised, and it lies in adultery and idolatry. John Paul II then goes on to combine the prophetism of the body and the marital act in what he calls the language of the body reread in truth. So taking these two things into consideration, that is fully realizes the language of the body. So most important conclusions that he draws from this is that the prophetic character given to the conjugal act, as it resembles the Old Testament in the current conjugal covenant. Also, this shows how the marital act looks to the future, and in that lies the necessary promise of the procreative meaning of the body and the potential for motherhood and fatherhood. So he goes on to speak more on what the language of the body means, and shows that how our body often acts even when we're not speaking, and thus speaks on our behalf, and that's what he means by language of the body. And in the conjugal act, that is the physical reaffirmation of the promises, of the marital promises, of love, of faithfulness, of integrity, of union until death. And every time the conjugal act takes place, that's a reaffirmation of those words that were spoken at the marriage ceremony when the man and the woman administered the sacraments to each other. And so that is a reaffirmation of those promises in the conjugal act, thus being language of the body. So those who reread the language of the body and express it not in truth are what he considers men and women of concupiscence. And that goes back to the adultery of the Old Testament, and then what Jesus considered in the Sermon on the Mount, adultery, not just physically but also spiritually, and so thus in that marital act with Jesus Christ, in those covenants, when we worship idols, that's idolatry, because we are breaking that promise and failing to love in that way. But the most beautiful aspect in this that John Paul II makes very clear is that in this concupiscence, in this rereading of the language of the body, in falsity, not in truth, God does not condemn us, rather he calls us. He calls us back to the truth. So John Paul II makes very clear that concupiscence, though it does make it very possible to reread the language of the body falsely, which will lead to errors and sin and very more evils, concupiscence does not destroy the capacity the language of the body has to be reread in truth. So there is always the possibility for every person to go back from error to truth and reread the language of the body in the correct sense. This allows man to constitute the sacramental sign as an enduring sign. It allows him to make that promise. It allows him to say that I will be faithful to you in joy and in sorrow, in sickness and in health, to love and to hold all the days of my life. And this is what John Paul II calls the hermeneutics of the sacrament, because it allows us to understand man on the basis of the analysis of the sacramental sign. And this means that man is not a slave to his passions. He's not a slave to his sexual desire, because he is capable, always capable of rereading the language of the body in truth, even though he may not always do it. And it is from this that John Paul II draws the conclusion that I mentioned earlier, which is that God does not condemn, he does not accuse, or he does not merely condemn, not merely accuse. He is always, above all, calling man back to the truth and to reread the language of the body in truth.
Hi, I will be doing part 2 of chapter 2 of the Dimension of the Sign, looking specifically at the Song of Songs, and then touching on part 3 and looking at the relationship between the liturgy and the language of the body. So when speaking of the Song of Songs, JP2 is really trying to emphasize that it is a representation and gives us concrete examples of the language of the body within a spousal relationship. So he really pushes this idea that Song of Songs is unique and that it is speaking of the love between the bride and the bridegroom. And so JP2 starts by dividing the Song of Songs and his reflections on it into 4 different topics. And so the first one is entitled Resuming Genesis Wonder. So to start off, I'm just going to read a quote from Genesis 2:23 through 25. So it says, Then the man said, This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. Therefore a man leaves his father and his mother and clings to his wife, and they become one flesh. And the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. So JP2 starts by really wanting us to go back to the beginning, to go back to these verses of Genesis, and really to view the Song of Songs as a dialogue based off of these, because this represents the covenant of marriage established by God as a sign for his love for us. And so really the Song of Songs is just a continuation of that, an expansion on this covenant of love. And so really throughout the poem, you're going to hear verses that are expressing this, the inner movements of the hearts of the man and the woman. And especially on the part of the man, at the first gaze of the woman, there are echoes of this flesh of my flesh or bone of my bones that we hear Adam say. And so we really see this expounded upon in the Song of Songs. Also, another thing that he notes is that the language of the body is very much present in the Song of Songs, but it's an unspoken language. It's a language of the heart. But really, through all of the words used, the man and the woman are expressing the individual feminine I or the individual masculine I, and really showing that to the world, like through verses of "She is all beautiful," and showing off the beauty in both of those eyes. Okay, so the second theme or topic is entitled "My Sister, My Bride," and so I'm going to read Song of Songs 4:9-10. You have ravished my heart, my sister, my bride. You have ravished my heart with a glance of your eyes, with one jewel of your necklace. How sweet is your love, my sister, my bride. How much better is your love than wine, and the fragrance of your oils than any spice. And so JP2 wants to note on this use of sister and bride together specifically. But he wants to say that using the word sister actually reveals more than using the woman's first name. So when the man says this, he's actually revealing more of who she is as a feminine I. And it really speaks to the unity of humanity and reveals an openness to the other, because now he is viewed as a brother in relation to her. And so there's this sense of openness, and there's a sense of security even within that relationship. Also, the use of sister works to reach back in time, in a sense, as if to show that the bride and the groom come from the same family circle, right? They feel as close as brother and sister. They have support and confidence in one another. Also, just this idea of them, coming from a common father, and a father who fashioned them in his image. And so it really shows and adds a little bit more depth, I think, to this idea of the masculine and the feminine I. The third part is entitled "A Garden Closed, a Fountain Sealed." And so I'm going to read Song 4:12. A garden locked is my sister, my bride. A garden locked, a fountain sealed. So I really love this imagery. I think it's beautiful. But here we're really seeing another representation or another vision of this feminine I, which is so important to JP2. And it's similar to what we found with the word sister, but it's a different representation. And so in this, by saying a garden locked, a fountain sealed, the bride is presenting herself as a mystery. Her feminine I, in the fullest sense, is hidden. She really asserts her dignity as a woman, and the idea that she is the master of her own mystery. This herself is a gift, and she chooses to whom she gives it to, and it's hers to do with what she wants to do with it. And so through this, because it doesn't just end there, but it continues with the woman ultimately giving herself to the man, there's really a consciousness of this reciprocal belonging between the man and the woman. But especially on the part of the woman, she makes it very clear that she belongs to the man, that she is now entrusting the mystery of herself to the man. So there's this deep level of trust and truth and freedom in the recognition that the man and the woman are now jointly, in a sense, given this mystery, or given hold of this mystery of who she is as a woman. So she's handing herself over as a gift to the man, to her spouse, ultimately leading to authentic love. And I think this is the context that it's trying to show, is that authentic love really entails this total gift of self, because there is a mystery. There's a mystery in the feminine I, even in the masculine I, and this sense of we have to give it as a gift. It cannot be taken from us in order for authentic love to come about. So there's this mutual recognition, there's this closeness, and through this closeness, the feelings of affection increase as well. So their bodies even begin to make manifest the language that is going on in the heart and that is growing stronger. So even in chapter 6, we see this when It's basically the bridegroom's praise of the bride, of her beauty, her physical attributes. And all of this is heightened in his eyes since she has given herself as a gift to him. So now the closed garden is open. And there's really this sense of their love being circular, where she has opened the garden. But we see, if we turn to Song 8, verses 6 through 7, set me as a seal upon your heart, as a seal upon your arm. For your love is strong as death, jealousy is cruel as the grave. Its flashes are flashes of fire, a most vehement flame. Many waters cannot quench love, neither can floods drown it. If a man offered for love all the wealth of his house, it would be utterly scorned. So this idea of setting her as a seal upon his heart, right? It's this idea of circular, their love is circular. So she has opened the garden. He has come in, and now she has sealed it. But she has sealed it with him, with her, being with her. And so a seal is placed on their hearts by this reciprocal gift of self in spousal love. And this is really the peak of the declaration of their love, is to set me as a seal upon your heart, because it's a closing of that circle. The last section of the Song of Songs is entitled Eros or Agape. And so this section, JP2 is emphasizing how the poem really shows the human face of Eros, of this sexual love or attraction. But it shows it free from defects, but it does not exclude its limitations. So while it's the pure sense of Eros, it does have its limitations. And so he notes how throughout the poem there's this constant longing of seeking more that cannot be found even in the love that they have. And so it's almost like this love goes beyond what they can even understand. And so this Eros is always in search. It's never satisfied. There's just this sense throughout the entire poem of restlessness. He talks about how in the song it shows that love is greater than what the body can even express. And there's this power that is shown in how the desire leads to loving union between the spouses, especially when it says love is as strong as death. But it also implies that there is this limitation, that in a sense, this love is limited by death. Also in Song 8:6, it talks about the love being jealous. So there's this exclusivity to the love. However, JP2 wants to note that this is not the end of love, that there is still this longing that continues. And so there's really, and this goes back to love and responsibility, I think, this need for the completion of Eros to surpass itself and to become a more mature form of love. The type of love that St. Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians, where love is patient, it is not envious, love never ends. It's this new and deeper horizon of love. And it's calling us even to a new communion. And this love is really what we call agape love. And so Eros must be perfected by agape love, because there is always a sense of longing. And agape love being that total gift of self, but it even surpasses this life. It even surpasses what we have on this life, because ultimately that love comes from God. And so in conclusion with the Song of Songs, it really, as a whole, is showing forth this truth of human love and the beauty to be found in it, and is very much a dialogue of what this love should look like when lived out in its truest form. And finally, to touch on the section of the language of the body as being related to the language of the liturgy, I think what JP2 wants us to turn to is Ephesians 5, where we see St. Paul call marriage a great mystery, but also how he relates the love which Christ has for his church to that type of spousal love. And so really this is a beautiful thing to think about, because when we approach the liturgy, to think of Christ coming to us in the Eucharist, of that union as spousal, we're given, I think, a deeper picture into the love that Christ has for us. And so this is something definitely I would encourage you to read, that section on the liturgy and the language of the body. Thank you.
Alrighty, I'm going to talk about part 2, chapter 3 of Theology of the Body. He gave them the law of life as their inheritance. So in this section, what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in a couple of different elements. I'm going to talk about JP2's Theology of the Body. I'm also going to make some connections to what we've read in Love and Responsibility. And I'm also going to just bring in his analysis of Humanae Vitae, because a lot of what he talks about in this section refers back to what's in that document. So we'll go ahead and get started. So first of all, he talks about the conjugal act, and he points out the two dimensions of the conjugal act, those being the unitive and the procreative elements of the act. And he explains that this is a moral norm that can be understood through a proper interpretation of the true language of the body that we've just walked through. But he also points out that the unitive and procreative aspects of the conjugal act, which are inseparable, are also rooted in biblical revelation and also in the personalistic norm that he describes in Love and Responsibility. So the combination of the true language of the body, the biblical background, and the personalistic norm create this moral norm for the conjugal act, where it has both a unitive and procreative dimension to it. From there, he moves into responsible parenthood. Now, responsible parenthood, as I have written here, I'm hoping you can read it all right, is judgments regarding the raising of children that consider a variety of factors that center around God's will. So responsible parenthood is not just about having children, when to have children, but it's actually the raising of children as well. But it has a lot to do with planning when God's calling you to have children. So it's not just an arbitrary decision of right now as a couple we don't want children, whether it's for personal reasons or preferential reasons. It's not an arbitrary thing, but rather it's for the good of my family, for the good of society, for the good of my community, or whatever other important factors that there might be. Right now is not the time to have children, or now is the time to have children. So it doesn't just have to do with not having children, but really the key to it is prudence. Practicing the virtue of prudence, making a prudent decision of, all right, God is calling us to have children right now. We're in a state right now where God's telling us to be open to expanding our family. And so he moves from there into talking about periodic continence. Periodic continence is a fancy way of referring to abstaining from sex for a period of time for a married couple. Now, there's a lot of elements of periodic continence that he discusses in Theology of the Body. First of all, the virtue of chastity is at the center of periodic continence because it requires a self-discipline, right? Mutual self-discipline and self-control over the desires of the body. Second of all, it's good for your marriage, and it grows your relationship because it creates a mutual dialogue between the two people in a marriage, between the two spouses, that otherwise might not be there. Thirdly, it acknowledges the self as a minister of God's design. So instead of saying that I am master of my own life, it's being obedient to the design that God has given us in our bodies, right? So it's a right, proper, true understanding of the language of the body that has been gone over already. Also, he points out periodic continence is not just a technique, but it's an ethic. So it's not just a biological, scientific understanding, but it's rather almost an ethical code that we are that we are submissive to. It's more than just a biology, but it's rather a correspondence to the truth of personhood and dignity as free, rational beings. I don't know if you can see that. I'll shrink this down here. So I'll read that one more time. Periodic continence has to do with more than just biology, but it's a correspondence to the truth of personhood and the dignity of a free, rational being. So really, again, it goes back to the language of the body. Periodic continence respects the language of the body, and it respects nature and the way that God designed us, rather than trying to take control of it ourselves. And finally, points out that practice is essential. So growth in chastity, especially for men, any man who, for instance, has practiced chastity and self-discipline in his own personal life, and then gotten into a relationship, with another, knows the challenge that comes with practicing chastity in that relationship. It's a whole nother game. It's a whole nother ballpark than chastity when you're outside of a relationship. And so that's something that JP2 emphasizes in Theology of the Body. Now I'd like to move to a list of distinctions between periodic continence and contraception. So John Paul II outlines some of the differences between the two, because many people following Humanae Vitae disagreed with the Church's teaching, and they didn't really understand the distinction between periodic continence and contraception. Right? A lot of people would look at that and say, well, they're both aimed at preventing having children. Well, there's a much deeper dimension to that, rooted in the language of the body and the personalistic norm. So, first of all, periodic continence is morally licit, contraception is morally illicit. And then here's kind of the reasons why. So, periodic continence, it respects nature. It respects, again, the language of the body, the built-in nature of fertility that is central to the human person, whereas contraception obstructs nature. Periodic continence involves self-mastery, self-denial, and self-gift. Overall, it just requires the practice of virtue. Contraception does not require these things. Rather, it promotes obsession, possession, and manipulation for selfish reasons or for personal gain. Rather than being self-gift, it's a manipulation of oneself and of nature for the sake of pleasure. Also, periodic continence respects the bond between sex and fertility. It recognizes fertility as an essential element of sex, whereas contraception tries to separate sex from fertility, and it denies both the unitive and the procreative elements of the conjugal act. Periodic continence enhances love because it creates that mutual dialogue between couples, whereas contraception inhibits love because it's not about that mutual dialogue, but rather it's taking control of oneself, one's sexual life. And finally, periodic continence is other-oriented, whereas contraception is self-centered. And again, it goes back to that mutual dialogue between the two spouses. Finally, I want to talk about the spiritual dimension of Humanae Vitae that John Paul II dives into in Theology of the Body. So, the spiritual dimension of Humanae Vitae, first of all, he clarifies that marital love is a gift from the Holy Spirit, and it's dependent on cooperation with God. Secondly, true conjugal love involves both of the dimensions of the conjugal act, both personal communion and responsible parenthood. Thirdly, rightly ordered conjugal love does not begin in the bedroom. And this is something that Dr. Swafford has talked about in class, how conjugal love, it doesn't just happen right when you walk into the bedroom or when you get in bed with your spouse, but rather it's a self-giving climax of erotic love that manifests the mutual affection of both spouses. And that has to do with both the sensual and emotional affection that is referred to in Love and Responsibility by JP2. Also, marital love reveres Christ. It puts Christ at the center of the relationship, and it unfolds the mystery of vocation between man and woman. John Paul II talks about how married love is a challenge. It has to do with the narrow way that Christ refers to in the Gospels. Next, prayer and sacraments are essential to holy marriage. Right? Going back to how marital love is a gift from the Holy Spirit is dependent on cooperation with God. So in order to have that healthy marital relationship, that holy marriage, we need grace in our lives. Finally, spiritual, divinely ordered interior... Finally, proper marital love involves a spiritual, divinely ordered interior climate that acknowledges the language of the body and fosters interior harmony and speaks true love. So that's kind of how John Paul II wraps up this section. He describes the spiritual, divine nature involved in the gift of self and marital love. And it respects both the language of the body, and so he talks about, right, the inseparability of divine love and truth. And he talks about how that is brought to fruition in rightly ordered marital love.
Good to see you again. My presentation is over chapter 3, part 2 of John Paul's Theology of the Body. It's pages 497 to 513 in the book that I have printed out. It's a pretty standard book, so I think that's everybody's as well. It covers 7 papal audiences, those Wednesdays, those weekly audiences, and it's divided into 4 sections. Those 4 sections are the power that flows from the sacramental consecration, an analysis of the virtue of continence, continence between arousal and emotion, the differences and the similarities, as well as the gift of reverence. So in the first papal audience, he straight out says that contraception is morally evil, and that not only is it bad for uniting the spouses, but can actually make them grow further apart. A big theme that he has throughout chapter 3, part 2, is he will quote Humanae Vitae a lot on matters of contraception and the unitive property, as well as the procreative property of the conjugal act. And he will also quote Ephesians chapter 5, verse 21, which is, I believe it's, let me find the actual quote here. Be subject to one another out of the fear of Christ. And that actually came as a shock to me, because in my translation, the NAB, I believe it's be subject to one another out of reverence for Christ. In this interpretation, in this book, it is quoted out of fear, more of a fearful reverence, a good fear to Christ. It goes on by saying that we must implore God for graces of the sacrament of marriage and from the living fountain of the Eucharist. In his next papal audience, which was held on October 10th, he goes back and summarizes what he talked about and grows and talks about it on a deeper level. He states that love is the power/capacity of the human spirit of a divine character, the power given to participate in the love of which God gives us, which is awesome. It's a love of knowing the truth. And if we talk about God philosophically, as usually St. Thomas Aquinas does, we want to say that God is simple. So God is truth. All other things that are true are only true as much as they pertain to God. Same thing with love. God is the source of all love. And all other things that have love within them only have love as much as they pertain to him. And I really like that theme of when loving your spouse, when in conjugal relations, it's only as beautiful and as loving as it pertains to God. Later, he will talk about how the Holy Spirit is actually intimately within the conjugal act, specifically whenever it's a sacramental marriage, when both are baptized. He talks about how concupiscence tries to detach the language of the heart from the language of the body. This reminds me of Brant Petree's book, Jesus Christ the Bridegroom, where Christ states, "This is my body, this is my blood," the language of the heart, and he shows it through the language of the body when he goes and gets crucified. Just like that with the conjugal act, when we say on the altar to our significant other, "This is my body, I promise to be devout to you until death do us part." When we go and participate in the conjugal act physically, the language of the heart, which was stated in the wedding, is now physically being told to the other, "I'm yours now and forever." And that's why it's so important to keep the conjugal act within marriage. But concupiscence, our nature to want to fall into sin due to the fall, derails these. And a big way to fight this concupiscence is by remembering the most important things about the conjugal act, which is 1, the unitive ability of the conjugal act to unite the spouses, but also 2, the openness to procreation and education of the offspring. And oftentimes the second part of that is not looked at as much as the first. The education of offspring is just as important, especially when it comes to matters of faith, because the parents are the main teachers of the child when it comes to faith. Later, he talks about how continence is important and how continence is the ability to master, orient, and control the sexual drives and their consequences in the psychosomatic subjectivity of human beings. A person has to devote themselves to the education of what conjugal sex is and how it's a self-gift in order to participate in it correctly, but I would not know from a personal standpoint. But that's what I've read in here. Continence is not just a mere freedom from sin, though. It's a freedom to fully give yourself to the significant other, fully give yourself to the other person as they fully give themselves to you. And it's so powerful and so loving that the two become one. He also talks about that in this and how it's through the power of the Holy Spirit that the two flesh become one, and how the Holy Spirit is intimately in the love that the marriage shares in the marriage bed. Lastly, I really like this. He talks about the differences between arousal and emotion, how arousal is bodily, it's sensual, it's expressing yourself bodily, whereas emotion is the wholeness of someone's masculinity or femininity. And it's not just bodily, it's the person as a whole. And when it comes to the conjugal act, it's super important to make these equal. They have to be equally distributed. You can't just be full of passion, but not really giving yourself emotionally outside of the conjugal act to your significant other. And you can't just give yourself emotionally, but then when it comes to the conjugal act, not giving yourself passionately or aroused to the other person. And as we read in Holy Sex, there are different ways of making sure both spouses are aroused and giving each other to themselves emotionally. Lastly, and what I really like is how important he talks about reverence, how important reverence is, reverence to the Holy Eucharist, to God first and foremost, and that is what leads to reverence to the other. When it comes to fully giving yourself in the bedroom, it's not about how much can I get, it's how much can I give. And as we talked about in Christian marriage, Dr. White actually said, when you do fully give yourself, when you're focused on self-gift, that's how the marital act is the most pleasurable, rather than just focusing on yourself. And in order to do that, they have to be rightly related through continence, and they have to be equal. At the end, he wraps it all up by saying that male and female share a particular eye. The two become one flesh. How beautiful the conjugal act is. It's a complete self-gift. And protecting the dignity of the conjugal act lies in protecting the dignity of the procreation and education of offspring. You can't have the unitive property without being open to procreation, because if you try to unite but you're not open to fully giving yourself, then you're not really uniting. And if you're trying to procreate just for the sake of procreate, you're not really uniting. So that is my summary of this. My video is pretty long, 7.5 minutes. I hope I don't get taxed for that.